Ayana Clark had one dream: to build a better life, a life her mother's sacrifices could be proud of. Ridgewood Academy, with its pristine halls and promise of opportunity, was supposed to be the first step. But from the moment Ayana stepped through its gates, she realized this school wasn't built for people like her. Her natural curls, her quiet determination, her very presence marked her as different, a target. At first, it was the stares, the whispers, the subtle barbs from classmates like Sarah Monroe. Then it was the cold, calculated criticism from her biology teacher, Ms. Novak. But when a lesson turns into an act of public humiliation, one that leaves Ayana's classmates laughing and her confidence shattered, her life begins to spiral. Just as she resolves to endure the cruelty in silence, Ayana uncovers a hidden truth. She's not the first. Others have suffered under the institution's elite facade, crushed by the same toxic power dynamics. Ayana faces a choice: stay silent and protect the fragile stability of her home life, or risk everything to expose the truth and fight for justice, not just for herself, but for everyone who has ever been silenced. With a twist that will leave you breathless, The Weight of Silence is a gripping story of resilience, courage, and the cost of finding your voice. Ayana's journey will break your heart, inspire you, and remind you of the power of standing up, even when the world tells you to sit down. The gates of Ridgewood Academy loomed large, polished metal gleaming in the morning sun. Ayana Clark adjusted the strap of her bag and took a deep breath. She could feel her mother's gaze from the car, her proud smile practically radiating encouragement. "You've got this, Ayana," her mother said, voice soft but firm. "Remember why you're here." "I know, Mom," Ayana replied, her tone a mix of nerves and determination. "Thanks for everything. I won't let you down." As she stepped onto the pristine campus, her heart raced. Students milled about in neatly pressed uniforms, their laughter and conversations echoing against the red brick buildings. Ayana noticed the way they glanced at her, their eyes lingering just a second too long. She tugged at her blazer, feeling uncomfortably aware of her natural curls, which stood out amid the sleek ponytails and polished hair of her peers. The bell rang, cutting through the crisp air, and Ayana made her way to her first class, biology with Ms. Novak. She whispered to herself, "It's just a school. You belong here." The biology lab was sterile and intimidating, with its rows of spotless desks and shelves lined with equipment. Ayana hesitated before stepping inside. "Take your seat," came a clipped voice. Ms. Novak, tall and sharp-featured, barely glanced up from her clipboard. "You must be Ayana Clark." "Yes, ma'am," Ayana replied, her voice small. "Good. Sit." Ms. Novak gestured toward an empty seat at the back without looking up. Ayana slid into her seat, trying not to notice the sideways glances from the students around her. Ms. Novak finally looked up, her icy blue eyes scanning the room before settling on Ayana. "This is Ridgewood Academy," she said, addressing the class but holding Ayana's gaze a second too long. "We hold ourselves to the highest standards. Mediocrity has no place here." Ayana's cheeks burned. She ducked her head, pretending to adjust her notebook. The lesson began, but every time Ms. Novak's gaze swept the room, Ayana felt its weight, as though she were being sized up and found lacking. At the end of class, Ms. Novak called out, "Miss Clark, stay behind for a moment." Ayana froze. The students filed out, some casting curious glances her way. "You've transferred here under exceptional circumstances," Ms. Novak began, her tone devoid of warmth. "I hope you understand that excellence is the expectation, not the goal. Do you?" "Yes, ma'am," Ayana managed. "Good." The teacher dismissed her with a slight wave. "You may go." The hallways were alive with chatter as students moved between classes. Ayana clutched her schedule, scanning the room numbers. She was so focused she didn't notice the group of girls blocking the corridor ahead. "Watch it!" snapped one of them as Ayana brushed past. The girl, tall and blonde, smirked down at her. "New girl, huh?" "Yeah," Ayana mumbled, stepping aside. Sarah Monroe, as Ayana would later learn, was the ringleader. "What's wrong?" "Too scared to say hi," she teased, her tone dripping with mock sweetness. Ayana bit her lip, refusing to engage. She ducked her head and hurried past, her face hot with embarrassment as Sarah and her friends snickered behind her. By the end of the day, Ayana felt drained. The weight of whispered comments and sideways glances pressed down on her. She approached her locker, hoping for a quiet moment to gather her things, but the hallway buzzed with activity. Sarah and her group lingered nearby, their laughter grating. "Look, it's Little Miss Tryhard," Sarah said, loud enough for Ayana to hear. Her friends giggled. Ayana kept her head down, silently grabbing her books. When she finally stepped outside, the crisp air offered a small relief. The walk home felt endless, her mind replaying every awkward interaction. At home, her mother greeted her warmly. "How was your first day?" "It was fine," Ayana lied, forcing a smile. She didn't want to burden her mother with the truth, not after everything she'd done to get Ayana here. Her mother beamed. "I'm so proud of you, sweetheart." Ayana nodded, the lump in her throat making it hard to respond. That night, she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling. "I just have to try harder," she whispered to herself. "It'll get better." The next morning, Ayana sat in front of her mirror, tying her hair into a neat bun. She smoothed down the blazer her mother had spent weeks saving for. "You can do this," she said, her reflection staring back at her. But doubt lingered in her eyes. As she entered the school, the whispers resumed, and Ayana braced herself for another day. Ms. Novak's words from the previous afternoon echoed in her mind. Excellence is the expectation. Her determination wavered under the relentless weight of judgment, but a small spark of resolve flickered. She would not let this school break her. She owed her mother that much. Ayana sat stiffly in her chair in biology class, clutching her pen as Ms. Novak paced in front of the whiteboard. The teacher's voice was sharp and precise, slicing through the room like a scalpel. Ayana's notes were meticulous, but her heart raced every time Ms. Novak's gaze swept over the students, lingering on her. "Miss Clark," Ms. Novak said suddenly, her voice cutting through Ayana's focus. "Explain the structure of a mitochondrion." Ayana froze. She had read about mitochondria the night before, but struggled to recall the details under the pressure of her teacher's glare. She fumbled with her notes, her voice barely a whisper. "It's the powerhouse of the cell?" The class erupted into snickers, and Sarah's loud whisper carried across the room. "That's all she knows." "Typical." Ms. Novak raised a single eyebrow, her expression icy. "Miss Clark, at this academy, we expect complete answers. If you can't meet that standard, perhaps you're in the wrong place." Ayana's cheeks burned as she sank lower in her seat. Her stomach churned, but she bit the inside of her cheek to keep her emotions in check. The next biology class was a hands-on demonstration. Ms. Novak wheeled in a tray with a model of a cat. "Today, we'll practice basic veterinary procedures," she announced, handing out supplies. "Miss Clark, come to the front." Ayana's heart sank as the room buzzed with murmurs. She stood slowly, her palms sweating as she approached the desk. Ms. Novak placed electric clippers in her hand and pointed at the model. "Shave the fur around the simulated wound," she instructed. As Ayana hesitated, Ms. Novak's eyes narrowed. "Discipline and precision, Miss Clark. If you can't handle a simple task, you'll never succeed." Ayana reached for the clippers, her hands trembling, but before she could begin, Ms. Novak stepped forward. "Actually, let me demonstrate." Without warning, she turned on the clippers and, in one swift motion, buzzed a small patch of Ayana's hair. The room fell silent, then erupted in gasps and stifled laughter. Ayana's breath caught in her throat as she reached up to touch the uneven patch on her head. Sarah whispered loudly, "Well, that's one way to fix that hair." "Let this be a lesson," Ms. Novak said coldly. "If you want to succeed, you must accept correction." Ayana felt tears prickling her eyes, but refused to let them fall. She grabbed her things and fled the room, the sound of laughter echoing behind her. Ayana spent the rest of the day avoiding everyone. Whispers and giggles seemed to follow her wherever she went. The patch of her hair that Ms. Novak had shaved felt exposed, a cruel reminder of her humiliation. As she entered the library to find solace, she saw Sarah and her group near the back, their laughter louder than usual. "Hey, Ayana," Sarah called mockingly. "You missed a spot." Ayana's hands tightened into fists, but she kept her head down and found an empty corner. She opened her notebook, but the words blurred on the page as tears filled her eyes. She blinked them away, refusing to let Sarah or Ms. Novak win. Instead, she began to write, documenting everything that had happened. After her last class, Ayana was walking toward the exit when she heard a voice behind her. "Ayana, wait up." She turned to see Mr. Warren, her English teacher, approaching her with a concerned expression. He held a stack of books and a coffee cup balanced precariously on top. "I noticed you left biology pretty upset earlier. Is everything okay?" Ayana hesitated, her instinct to brush it off warring with the growing lump in her throat. "It's fine," she said quickly. "I just needed some air." Mr. Warren studied her for a moment. "I've been a teacher long enough to know when a student is struggling. My door is always open if you need to talk." "Thanks, but I'm fine," Ayana said, her voice tight. She hurried away before he could press further, her emotions threatening to spill over. At home that evening, Ayana tried to hide the patch of missing hair under a headband, but her mother noticed immediately. "Ayana, what happened to your hair?" "It's nothing, Mom," Ayana muttered, focusing on her homework. "It's not nothing," her mother said, her tone firm. She knelt in front of Ayana, gently tilting her chin up. "Tell me the truth." Ayana hesitated. Then the words poured out. She told her mother everything. Ms. Novak's harsh treatment, the incident with the clippers, and the relentless bullying from Sarah and her friends. As she spoke, tears streamed down her face. Her mother's expression shifted from shock to fury. "That woman had no right to do that to you," she said, her voice shaking. "Tomorrow, I'm going to the school." "No, Mom, please." Ayana interrupted. "If you make a scene, it'll just make things worse." "I'll handle it." Her mother's face softened, but her anger didn't fade. "Ayana, you don't have to handle this alone. You're my daughter, and I won't let anyone treat you this way. I don't want to disappoint you," Ayana whispered. "You could never disappoint me," her mother said, pulling her into a hug. "We'll figure this out together." As Ayana clung to her mother, she felt a glimmer of hope. Maybe she didn't have to face this alone after all. The next morning, Ayana walked into Ms. Novak's classroom, head held high despite the tension gripping her chest. She had spent hours the previous night rehearsing how she'd handle the whispers, the stares, and the memory of the clippers against her scalp. "Miss Clark," Ms. Novak said as soon as Ayana sat down, her voice slicing through the room. "I trust you're ready to contribute something meaningful today?" Ayana didn't flinch. "Yes, ma'am," she said evenly, her tone giving away nothing. She pulled out her notebook and focused on her notes, determined not to show how much she still felt the humiliation. Ms. Novak's gaze lingered for a moment longer than necessary before she turned to address the class. As the lesson progressed, Ayana made no mistakes and avoided Ms. Novak's pointed attempts to catch her off guard. But the silence from her classmates was deafening. Though they didn't openly laugh or comment, Ayana could feel the unspoken tension, like everyone was waiting for her to crack. She caught Sarah's smirk from across the room, but chose not to react. As the bell rang, Ayana slipped out of the classroom and found an empty stairwell. She leaned against the wall, her breath coming fast. Pulling her phone from her pocket, she began typing everything that had happened into a document. A record she wasn't sure what she'd do with yet, but knew she might need. Lunch was its own battlefield. Ayana carried her tray to the farthest corner of the cafeteria, where she could eat in relative peace. But Sarah and her friends soon appeared, as if drawn to her discomfort. "Hey, Ayana," Sarah said, plopping into the seat across from her. "Cool hair. Thinking of shaving the other side to match?" Laughter erupted from the group. Ayana's hands tightened around her fork, but she stayed silent. Reacting would only feed their cruelty. "What's wrong?" Sarah pressed, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Too good to talk to us?" "Leave me alone, Sarah," Ayana said quietly, keeping her eyes on her tray. Sarah's grin widened. "Wow, you do have a voice. Thought maybe Ms. Novak scared it out of you." The tension at the table was unbearable. Ayana stood abruptly, grabbing her tray. "Go bother someone else," she muttered, walking away before her anger spilled over. As she passed the trash can, she noticed a folded piece of paper stuffed into her backpack pocket. Curious and wary, she pulled it out later in the restroom. In thick block letters, the note read, "You don't belong here." Ayana's hands trembled as she crumpled the note. The words echoed what she had been feeling all along, but seeing them in writing made her anger flare. She stuffed the note deep into her bag, vowing not to let it break her. By the time Ayana reached the library after school, she felt drained. She settled into her usual corner with a textbook, trying to push the day's events out of her mind. "Hey," came a soft voice. Ayana looked up to see Emma Patel, a quiet girl from her biology class, standing nearby with a book clutched to her chest. "Do you mind if I sit here?" Emma asked hesitantly. Ayana shrugged. "Sure." For a while, they worked in silence, but Ayana could feel Emma's gaze flickering toward her. Finally, Emma spoke. "I saw what happened in class yesterday," she said, her voice low. "I'm really sorry about what Ms. Novak did." Ayana blinked, surprised. "You don't have to apologize. It's not your fault." Emma bit her lip. "I know, but it wasn't right. And nobody stood up for you. I didn't know what to do." Ayana closed her textbook, studying Emma's earnest expression. "It's fine," she said after a moment. "I'm used to it. You shouldn't have to be," Emma replied firmly. "If you ever, I don't know, need someone to talk to or something, I'm here." Ayana felt a strange warmth at Emma's words, though she didn't quite know how to respond. "Thanks," she murmured. Emma nodded, returning to her book, and Ayana felt the weight on her shoulders lighten just slightly. That evening, Ayana sat at the kitchen table, trying to focus on her homework, when her mother entered the room. "What's this?" Mrs. Clark asked, holding up the crumpled note Ayana had forgotten to throw away. Ayana froze, her pen hovering over the paper. "It's nothing," she said quickly. Her mother's eyes narrowed. "This doesn't look like nothing. You don't belong here? Who wrote this?" "I don't know," Ayana admitted. "It doesn't matter." "Of course it matters," Mrs. Clark exclaimed, her voice rising. "Why didn't you tell me this was happening?" "Because it'll just make things worse if you get involved," Ayana said, her voice cracking. Her mother sat down across from her, her expression softening. "Ayana, I know you don't want me to fight your battles for you, but this isn't right. What's happening at that school? It's not just bullying. It's something bigger. You shouldn't have to deal with this alone." Ayana stared at her notebook, tears blurring the words on the page. I don't want them to think I can't handle it." Mrs. Clark reached across the table, taking Ayana's hand. "You don't have to prove anything to them. You're smart, brave, and you have every right to be there. And I'll make sure they know it." Ayana nodded, though her heart still felt heavy. Her mother's support gave her strength, but she couldn't shake the fear of what might happen if they took a stand. The next day, Mr. Warren caught Ayana as she left English class. "Ayana, can we talk for a minute?" Ayana hesitated but nodded. They stepped into the empty classroom, where Mr. Warren leaned against his desk, his expression serious. "I heard about what happened in biology," he began, "and I've noticed the way Ms. Novak treats you. It's not okay." Ayana crossed her arms, wary of where this was going. "What are you going to do about it?" "I want to help," Mr. Warren said simply, "but I need to know if you're willing to stand up for yourself. Have you thought about documenting what's been happening?" Ayana frowned. "Documenting? Writing it all down," Mr. Warren explained. "Dates, details, witnesses, everything. If you ever decide to bring this to the administration, having evidence will make your case stronger." Ayana considered his words. She had already been keeping notes for herself, but she hadn't thought of using them as evidence. "And what if they don't listen?" she asked quietly. "Then we find someone who will," Mr. Warren said, his tone resolute. "But you don't have to decide now. Just know that I'm in your corner." For the first time, Ayana felt a spark of hope. Maybe, with Mr. Warren and her mother's support, she could find a way to fight back. Ayana sat in the library, flipping through her notebook. Each entry chronicled another instance of cruelty, another way Ridgewood Academy had chipped at her resolve. She was tired of the stares, the whispers, and Ms. Novak's cold dismissals, but she wasn't ready to give up. "Hey," Ayana, came a familiar, tentative voice. Looking up, she saw Emma Patel hovering nearby. "Can I sit?" "Sure," Ayana said, offering a small smile. Emma had been kind since the beginning, but Ayana wasn't sure if she wanted or could handle more sympathy. Emma hesitated before speaking. "You're not the only one she's done this to, you know." Ayana blinked. "What do you mean?" Emma set her bag down and leaned closer. "There was a girl last year. Same kind of thing. Ms. Novak humiliated her in front of the whole class. She didn't shave her hair, but—" Emma trailed off, her face tight. "She pushed that girl so hard she ended up transferring schools." Ayana's stomach turned. Why didn't anyone say anything? Emma looked away. No one ever does. Everyone's scared. Ayana closed her notebook. Maybe it's time someone did. For the first time, Emma met her gaze head-on. "I'll help you." Ayana felt braver walking through the halls the next day, her conversation with Emma replaying in her mind. If others had faced the same treatment, maybe she could gather enough stories to make the school listen. As she reached her locker, the familiar sound of Sarah's laughter hit her like a slap. "Look who's decided to show up," Sarah sneered, leaning against the lockers with her group of friends. "How's it feel being everyone's favorite project?" "Leave me alone, Sarah," Ayana said evenly, gripping her backpack. Sarah stepped closer, her voice dripping with mock concern. "Oh, don't be so sensitive. We're just trying to help you toughen up. You're gonna need it if you want to survive here." Ayana's anger flared, but she stood her ground. "I'm not scared of you." The hallway fell silent. Sarah blinked, caught off guard by Ayana's calm defiance. For a moment, it seemed like she might back down, but instead, she let out a dry laugh. "Whatever," Sarah said, tossing her hair. "See you around, loser." As Sarah walked away, Ayana realized something. She wasn't as powerless as she'd thought. For the first time, Sarah had looked unsure. Later that afternoon, Ayana sat with Emma and a small group of students Emma had introduced her to. They were huddled in the far corner of the library, speaking in hushed voices. "There's strength in numbers," Emma said. "If we all write down what we've experienced, or what we've seen, it'll be harder for the school to ignore us." A boy named Caleb, who had been quiet until now, nodded. "Novak humiliated me in front of the whole class last semester. I never told anyone because I figured no one would care." "They will," Ayana said firmly, "if we make them." Over the next hour, they shared their stories, writing them down in detail. Ayana couldn't help but feel a spark of hope as she read their accounts. She wasn't alone, and she wasn't the only one willing to fight back. With their evidence in hand, Ayana and her mother requested a meeting with the principal, Mr. Townsend. Ayana's heart pounded as she and her mother stepped into the richly furnished office. "Thank you for coming," Mr. Townsend said, gesturing for them to sit. His polite smile didn't quite reach his eyes. "What can I do for you?" Mrs. Clark didn't waste time. "My daughter has been subjected to bullying and public humiliation by Ms. Novak, and she's not the only one. We've brought statements from other students." Mr. Townsend's expression hardened as he scanned the papers they handed him. "I see," he said slowly. "However, I must remind you that Ms. Novak is a highly respected teacher. These allegations are serious, but they will need to be thoroughly investigated." "So investigate," Mrs. Clark shot back. "But until you do, my daughter deserves to feel safe in your school." Mr. Townsend leaned back, his smile now forced. "We take all concerns seriously, but you must understand the challenges of managing such a high-performing institution. We can't make rash decisions based on emotional reactions." Ayana felt anger rising in her chest, but her mother placed a hand on her arm, silently telling her to stay calm. "You have the evidence," Mrs. Clark said, her tone firm. "Now it's up to you to act on it." "But if you don't, we will." Ayana left the meeting feeling a mix of anger and determination. She wasn't sure if Mr. Townsend would do anything, but she knew she couldn't rely on the administration alone. That evening, she met with Emma and the others in the library again. "We need to make this public," Ayana said. "If the school won't listen, we'll make them." "How?" Caleb asked. "We'll share our stories," Ayana replied. "Online, with parents, with anyone who will listen. If they won't protect us, We'll make sure everyone knows what's happening here." Emma hesitated. "Are you sure? Once it's out there, it'll be hard to take back." Ayana nodded. "It's the only way." As the group began brainstorming their plan, Ayana felt something she hadn't in a long time: hope. They were no longer fighting alone, and together, they might just be able to make a difference. Ayana stood at the library table, her notes and collected evidence spread out before her. Around her sat Emma, Caleb, and the few other students who had bravely shared their stories. Each face held a mixture of determination and nerves. "We've got enough here to show the administration they can't ignore this anymore," Ayana said, her voice steady. "But we need more voices. If other students are willing to step forward, it'll be harder for them to dismiss us." Caleb leaned back in his chair. "I can talk to a couple of people. There are others Ms. Novak has humiliated. Some of them transferred, but a few are still here." Emma nodded. "I'll reach out to people quietly. If they don't want to share publicly, we can collect anonymous statements." Ayana felt a swell of gratitude for her friends. "Thank you," she said softly. "We're doing this not just for us, but for everyone who's ever been silenced." The next day, Ayana walked into biology class with her head held high. She knew Ms. Novak had heard about their complaints. Word traveled quickly in Ridgewood Academy's tightly knit halls. The teacher's sharp eyes narrowed as Ayana took her seat. "Miss Clark," Ms. Novak said, her tone icy, "I trust you finally prepared for today's discussion?" Ayana met her gaze. "Yes, ma'am." "Good. Explain to the class the process of mitosis in detail," Ms. Novak said, crossing her arms. The challenge in her voice was clear. Ayana stood, her knees slightly trembling, but she took a deep breath and began to explain. Her voice was steady, her facts precise. She had spent the night preparing, knowing Ms. Novak might try something like this. When she finished, the room was silent. Ms. Novak's lips thinned, but she nodded curtly. "Adequate," she said. Ayana sat down, her heart pounding. She caught Sarah's surprised glance from across the room. For the first time, Ayana felt the respect she had fought so hard for. That afternoon, Ayana, her mother, and several other parents gathered in the principal's office. Mr. Townsend looked uneasy as Mrs. Clark began laying out their evidence. She was calm but forceful, detailing every instance of Ms. Novak's mistreatment and the harm it had caused. Another parent, Mr. Patel, added, "My daughter has been afraid to speak up for months. This isn't just about one teacher. This is about the culture you've allowed to fester here." Mr. Townsend raised his hands in a placating gesture. "We take these allegations very seriously," he said. "Ms. Novak is an accomplished educator." "Her accomplishments don't excuse abuse," Mrs. Clark interrupted, her voice firm. Ayana glanced at the students sitting beside her. Each of them had spoken their truth, and their courage gave her strength. "We deserve better," Ayana said quietly but firmly. "And we're not going to stay silent anymore." After a long pause, Mr. Townsend sighed. "We will conduct a thorough investigation. In the meantime, Ms. Novak will be placed on leave." It wasn't a complete victory, but it was a step forward. Ayana left the office feeling lighter than she had in weeks. In the days following the meeting, Ayana noticed a change in the hallways. Sarah and her friends no longer targeted her with cruel remarks or mocking laughter. Instead, Sarah seemed quieter, almost subdued. One afternoon, as Ayana gathered her books from her locker, Sarah approached her. "Hey," she said awkwardly. Ayana raised an eyebrow. "What do you want, Sarah?" Sarah shifted uncomfortably. I didn't mean for things to get so bad. I didn't think." "You didn't think," Ayana said flatly. "That much is clear." Sarah frowned but didn't argue. "I just wanted to say, I'm sorry. For everything." Ayana stared at her for a moment, then nodded curtly. "Okay." She didn't feel the need to say more. Sarah's apology wouldn't undo the pain she had caused, but it was enough to see that her power had faded. A week later, Ridgewood Academy announced a series of initiatives to address bullying and ensure student safety. Ayana listened as Mr. Townsend made the announcement over the intercom, her heart swelling with pride. That afternoon, Ayana and her friends sat in the library, brainstorming ideas for a student-led anti-bullying campaign. Caleb suggested a peer support group, while Emma proposed workshops to help students recognize and challenge harmful behaviors. As they worked, Ayana felt a renewed sense of purpose. Her fight wasn't over, but she knew she had already made a difference. When she got home that evening, her mother greeted her with a hug. "I'm so proud of you," Mrs. Clark said. "You stood up for what's right, even when it was hard." Ayana smiled. "I couldn't have done it without you." That night, as she lay in bed, Ayana thought about how far she had come. Ridgewood Academy had tried to silence her, but she had found her voice and used it to create change. For the first time, she felt truly hopeful about the future. The morning announcement echoed through the halls of Ridgewood Academy, Mr. Townsend's voice unusually upbeat. "Good morning, students. I'm pleased to announce several new initiatives aimed at fostering a supportive and inclusive environment here at Ridgewood Academy. These policies will include a zero-tolerance approach to bullying, improved teacher training, and a peer-led support program. Let's work together to ensure every student feels valued and respected." Ayana leaned against her locker, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She knew this moment wouldn't have happened without the courage of her peers and the determination she had found within herself. Emma approached, her expression bright. "Did you hear that? We actually made a difference." "We did," Ayana replied, her voice soft but filled with pride. As students shuffled to their classes, Ayana noticed fewer glances filled with judgment or mockery. For the first time, Ridgewood Academy didn't feel so suffocating. Later that day, Ayana and Emma sat outside on one of the campus benches, enjoying the rare warmth of a spring afternoon. "You've changed a lot since the first day," Emma said, her tone thoughtful. Ayana laughed lightly. "You mean I'm not hiding in corners anymore?" "Exactly," Emma replied with a grin. "You've always been brave. You just needed to see it." Ayana looked at her friend, gratitude shining in her eyes. "Thanks for standing by me. I don't think I could have done any of this without you." Emma shrugged. "You didn't need me. I just reminded you of what you were already capable of." Their conversation was interrupted by Caleb, who approached hesitantly. "Hey, I was wondering if you both would want to help plan the first meeting for the peer support group? It's going to be next week." Ayana nodded. "Absolutely. Let's make it something people actually feel comfortable coming to." The three of them began brainstorming, laughter and ideas filling the air. For the first time, Ayana felt like she truly belonged. That evening, Ayana sat at the kitchen table with her mother, recounting the day's events. "They're actually doing it, Mom. New policies, assemblies, everything." Mrs. Clark smiled, her eyes brimming with pride. "That's because of you, Ayana. You stood up, even when it was hard." Ayana hesitated. "I couldn't have done it without you pushing me to talk in the first place." Her mother reached across the table, squeezing Ayana's hand. "You've taught me something too, watching you fight for yourself and others. It reminded me how important it is to never back down." Tears welled in Ayana's eyes. "Thank you, Mom, for everything." As they sat in the warm glow of their modest kitchen, Ayana felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in months. The following week, Ayana stood on the stage of the school's auditorium, her heart pounding. The assembly was packed, the room buzzing with anticipation. Taking a deep breath, Ayana stepped up to the microphone. "Hi, everyone. My name is Ayana Clark, and I want to talk to you about what it means to be heard." She scanned the room, catching glimpses of familiar faces. Emma's encouraging smile, Caleb's nod of support, even Sarah's subdued gaze. "Like many of you, I came to Ridgewood Academy hoping for an opportunity to succeed. But what I found instead was silence. Silence from people who saw what was happening and did nothing. Silence from myself, because I was too scared to speak up." Her voice grew stronger. "But silence doesn't protect us. It isolates us. And the only way we can change things is by breaking that silence." The room was quiet as Ayana shared her journey, her voice unwavering. When she finished, the applause was thunderous. For the first time, she felt the weight of her story lift. On a crisp Monday morning, Ayana walked through the gates of Ridgewood Academy, her head held high. The sun streamed through the towering windows, casting warm light on the polished floors. The school that had once felt cold and hostile now felt different. like a place where she could breathe. As she passed students in the hall, she noticed nods of acknowledgement, even small smiles. Emma joined her, falling into step beside her. Big day. First support group meeting after school. I'm ready, Ayana said, and for the first time, she truly meant it. As the day unfolded, Ayana reflected on how far she had come. From a girl who felt invisible to someone who had changed not only her life but the lives of others. Standing in the library that afternoon, welcoming students to the first meeting of the peer support group, Ayana felt a surge of pride. She knew the fight wasn't over, but she also knew she was no longer fighting alone. Together, they were building something new, a community where everyone could feel safe and valued. And as Ayana looked around the room, her heart swelled with hope. Ridgewood Academy had tried to silence her, but she had found her voice, and it was stronger than ever.